The year was 2187, and the Galactic Concord Assembly was packed like it always was during summit season. Hundreds of delegates from over 200 different species, all crammed into the grand amphitheater on Xylos Prime. The air hummed with translator drones, the scent of alien perfumes, and the low buzz of political tension. Up on the main dais, a motion was being debated that had already stirred more controversy than anyone expected. A full ban on human vessels entering the Andromeda exclusion zone. Now, to most of the galaxy, the exclusion zone was just a patch of space nobody really understood, filled with weird energy readings, ancient ruins and rumors of things that vanished without a trace. The Velnari, a species known for their caution and long memories, had been pushing for stricter controls for years. They'd lost 3 of their own ships there decades ago, and not a single signal ever came back. The Cathar, scarred by some old war nobody liked to talk about, backed them completely. Their argument was simple. Humans didn't respect boundaries. They poked, prodded, and pushed until something broke, and usually it wasn't them. But the rest of the room? They weren't buying it. When the human ambassador stood to speak, a ripple of quiet laughter spread through the chamber. Not loud, just enough to be heard. The Zorathi, tall reptilian beings with shimmering scales and a habit of mocking anything they didn't understand, leaned back in their seats with smug grins. One of them even mimed scratching its head like a confused monkey. The insectoid Mirkesh, whose compound eyes rarely blinked, clicked their mandibles in what passed for amusement among their kind. The human delegate didn't flinch. She spoke calmly, clearly, laying out data from Earth's deep space observatories, patterns in the zone's energy fluctuations that suggested something wasn't just broken out there. It was alive, or at least reacting. She warned that sending any ship in, human or otherwise, might trigger something they couldn't control. She wasn't asking for special treatment, just caution. But caution wasn't popular that day. Are we really afraid of ghosts because the hairless apes say so? A Zorathi delegate sneered into the mic, drawing chuckles from half the room. Another delegate, from a bird-like species known for their speed and impatience, waved a wing dismissively. Humans treat every mystery like a door they must kick open. Maybe they should learn to walk away. The human ambassador just stood there, quiet now, her expression unreadable. She knew arguing wouldn't help. The Conquered ran on consensus, and consensus was built on trust. And right now, the galaxy didn't trust humans to know their limits. They saw Earth's rapid expansion, their bold missions into unknown sectors, their stubborn refusal to accept no as an answer, and mistook it for arrogance. The vote came quickly. Overwhelmingly, the motion failed. The Andromeda exclusion zone would remain open to all, including humans. The room erupted in relieved chatter, as if a silly human fear had just been put to rest. Some delegates even clapped each other on the back, joking about keeping an eye on those reckless Earthlings. But the human ambassador didn't smile. She walked out slowly, past rows of smirking faces and whispering clusters of diplomats, her boots clicking softly against the polished floor. Outside, the twin suns of Xylos Prime cast long shadows. She looked up at the sky, not at the stars, but at the empty patch where the Andromeda zone would be if you could see it from here. She knew what the others didn't. It wasn't about pride. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about what they'd already seen. Back on Earth, deep in a secure facility buried under the Arctic ice, scientists had been analyzing faint signals from the edge of the zone for months. Not radio waves, not energy pulses, something stranger, like echoes of thought, distorted memories, fragments of language twisted into shapes that made human brains ache just listening to them. One researcher had gone mute after 3 days of exposure. Another had drawn the same symbol over and over on every surface in her quarters until security had to sedate her. The data was classified. Not because Earth wanted to hide it, but because they didn't want to cause panic. Or worse, curiosity. Now with the Concord's decision public, Earth's Fleet Command had a choice. Obey the spirit of the warning and stay out. Or send a ship to confirm what they feared. They chose the latter not out of defiance but duty. If something dangerous was waking up out there, someone had to look. And if anyone was going to face it, it might as well be humans. After all, they were the only ones who seemed to understand that some doors shouldn't just be opened, they should be welded shut. 3 months later, the UNS Odyssey, a modest survey vessel with a crew of 12, slipped past the official boundary markers and entered the Andromeda exclusion zone. No fanfare. No announcement. Just a quiet course correction and a final message home. Beginning final approach. All systems green. The conquered barely noticed. Most had already forgotten the debate. The Zorathi were busy negotiating trade routes. The Mirakesh were deep in a cultural exchange program. Life went on, but on Earth, in mission control, silence fell the moment the Odyssey crossed the threshold. Screens flickered with strange interference. Sensors glitched. And then nothing, no signal. No emergency beacon, not even static. Search teams from 3 different species went looking, scanning the area with every tool they had. They found empty space, cold, quiet, and utterly normal. No wreckage. No debris field. Not even a single atom out of place. The galaxy shrugged. Another human gamble gone wrong, they said. They flew too close to the edge. What did they expect? But Earth didn't mourn publicly. They didn't demand answers, they just waited. And 6 weeks later, a small, unmarked courier ship docked at the conquered central hub. No fanfare. No announcement. Just a sealed data capsule handed over to the assembly security chief with 2 words. Play this. Nobody knew what was inside. Not yet, but the human ambassador was already on her way back to Xylos Prime. This time she didn't ask for the floor. She just took a seat in the back of the chamber, folded her hands and waited. Because she knew, soon, the laughter would stop. 3 months after the vote, the UNS Odyssey slipped quietly out of Earth's orbital dock and headed deeper into space than most ships ever dared to go. There were no speeches, no farewell parties, no live broadcasts. Just a crew of 12, scientists, engineers, pilots, boarding a ship that looked more like a floating lab than a war vessel. They weren't soldiers. They weren't thrill-seekers. They were people who believed that if something strange was happening out there, someone had to understand it before it became a threat to everyone. Their mission wasn't to conquer or claim. It was to watch, listen, and, if possible, warn. Earth's top researchers had spent weeks analyzing faint signals from the edge of the Andromeda exclusion zone. The patterns didn't match any known natural phenomenon. They pulsed like a heartbeat, but the rhythm changed each time, as if learning, adapting. One scientist described it as a mind trying to speak through static. Another said it felt like being watched. From inside your own thoughts, the crew knew the risks. They'd read the reports. They'd seen what happened to the few who'd come too close before. Ships that vanished without a trace. Crews that sent back garbled messages before going silent forever. But they also knew that ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. If the zone was dangerous, the whole galaxy needed to know. And if humans were the only ones willing to look, then so be it. For the first 2 weeks, everything was normal. Routine scans, system checks, quiet meals in the mess hall. The crew joked, shared stories from home, watched old Earth movies to pass the time. They even celebrated a birthday with a cake made from recycled protein paste, dry, but sweet enough to bring smiles. Then on day 18, they crossed the invisible line. The moment they entered the exclusion zone, the ship's sensors went haywire. Not in a dramatic way, no alarms blaring, no sparks flying. Just wrongness. Compasses spun for no reason. Star maps flickered like old film. The AI navigation system kept correcting its own course, then undoing the correction seconds later, as if confused by something it couldn't see. The crew stayed calm. They'd trained for anomalies. They ran diagnostics, rebooted systems, double-checked coordinates. Everything seemed fine except nothing was. On day 20 they spotted it, the silent spire. It hung in the void like a broken tooth, massive, black, and utterly still. No lights, no movement. Just a jagged structure stretching thousands of kilometers into the dark, covered in symbols no one could read. Scans showed it was older than any known civilization. Older than stars, maybe, and yet it wasn't dead. As the Odyssey drifted closer, just close enough to get a clear reading, the spire reacted. Not with weapons. Not with force. But with something far stranger. The lights inside the ship dimmed, not because of a power failure, but as if the ship itself was holding its breath. The crew's neural implants, standard issue for deep space missions, began picking up whispers. Not voices exactly, more like half-formed thoughts, emotions without words, fear, curiosity, hunger. One engineer later described it as hearing your own memories played backward. Then the real trouble started, Objects began moving on their own. A coffee cup floated off a table. Tools drifted out of locked compartments. Not violently, just gently, like they were being rearranged by invisible hands. The ship's AI started speaking in riddles, repeating phrases like, "Do you remember the silence before birth?" And "What is your name when no one calls it?" Panic didn't take hold, not yet. The crew had been trained for psychological stress. They grounded themselves in routine. Check oxygen levels, verify hull integrity, run comms tests. But every test came back normal. The ship was fine. Their bodies were fine. It was the space around them that felt broken. On day 21, they tried to leave. They turned the ship around, fired the engines, and aimed for the edge of the zone. But no matter how fast they went, the stars outside didn't change. It was like running on a treadmill in space. The spire stayed dead ahead, unmoving, as if the universe itself had folded around them. That's when they realized they weren't trapped by walls or force fields. They were trapped by perception. The spire wasn't just a structure. It was rewriting the rules of reality around it, and the Odyssey was caught in its dream. Still, the crew didn't give up. They tried everything. They sent out drones, vanished before they traveled a kilometer. They broadcast emergency signals, received only silence in return. They even attempted to shut down all non-essential systems, hoping to become invisible. But the spire didn't care about power or noise. It cared about attention. The more they tried to understand it, the tighter its grip became. By day 22, time itself started to warp. Hours felt like minutes. Minutes stretched into days. One crew member swore they'd eaten breakfast 3 times in a row. Another claimed they'd just woken up from a nap that never happened. Sleep became dangerous. Dreams bled into waking life, and soon no one could tell what was real. Yet through it all, they kept working. Not for glory, not for rescue, but because that's what humans do. When the world stops making sense, they keep trying to fix it. They notice something odd. The spire reacted strongest to curiosity. Every time someone asked a question out loud, every time they ran a new scan, the distortions worsened. But when they sat in silence, doing nothing, the pressure eased slightly. That's when the plan formed. Not a plan to escape, but a plan to warn. They realized they might not make it out. But if they could send a message, just one clear warning, they could save others from making the same mistake. The problem was any normal signal would be twisted or erased by the zone's interference. So they got creative. Using the ship's last stable power source, they encoded a message not in standard galactic code, but in fragments of ancient Earth languages: Sumerian, Proto-Indo-European, Old Norse, languages so old, so obscure, that only a handful of scholars in the entire galaxy could even recognize them. The idea was simple. If the spire fed on understanding, then a message it couldn't comprehend might slip through. They also embedded the warning in patterns of silence, pauses between signals, gaps in data streams, because sometimes what you don't say is louder than what you do. With minutes to spare, they triggered the quantum entanglement relay, a failsafe that could send data instantly across any distance, even through warped space. The system had never been tested under these conditions, but it was their only shot. The last thing recorded wasn't a scream. It wasn't panic. It was calm. "We're not fighting it," someone said over the comms. "We're just stepping aside." Then the feed cut out. Back on Earth, Mission Control watched the signal vanish. No explosion. No distress call. Just nothing. For days, they hoped. They scanned every frequency, replayed every second of the final transmission, but there was no trace of the Odyssey. It was as if it had never existed. The Conquered heard about the loss, of course, but to them, it was just another human ship lost to human recklessness. They ignored the warnings, they said. They paid the price. What they didn't know was that the crew hadn't ignored the warnings. They'd become the warning, and soon the galaxy would hear it, whether they wanted to or not. 6 weeks after the Odyssey vanished, a small, unmarked ship docked at the Conquered's central hub on Xylos Prime. It wasn't flashy, just a battered courier vessel with faded Earth markings and a hull patched with mismatched plating. No escort, no fanfare. The pilot didn't even step out. Instead, they handed a sealed data capsule to a security officer through the airlock, said 2 words, "Play this," and left before anyone could ask questions. Inside the capsule was something no one expected. The final transmission from the Odyssey. Not a distress call, not a last message home, but raw, unedited footage from the ship's internal and external cameras, recorded during its last 12 minutes in the Andromeda exclusion zone. At first, the Concorde didn't know what to do with it. Some thought it was a hoax, a human attempt to save face after another failed mission. Others assumed it would be emotional, dramatic, full of last goodbyes and tearful confessions. They almost didn't screen it at all, but the human ambassador insisted. Quietly, firmly. She didn't beg. She didn't argue. She just said, "You voted to let us go in. Now watch what happened when we did." Reluctantly, the assembly agreed to a private viewing. Not in the main chamber, too public, but in a secure briefing room deep inside the Concorde complex. Only senior delegates were invited. The mood was casual, almost bored. A few brought snacks. One Zarathi delegate joked that he hoped it had good special effects. The human ambassador sat alone in the back corner, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the blank screen. She'd seen the footage once, back on Earth. She hadn't slept since. The lights dimmed. The screen flickered to life. At first, it looked completely normal. The inside of the Odyssey, clean, well-lit, humming with the soft sounds of a working ship. Crew members moved calmly through the corridors, checking panels, sipping from mugs, chatting in low voices. Outside the viewports, stars glittered in perfect silence. There was no music, no narration, just raw feed from the ship's recorders. Then slowly, things began to change. A cup floated off a table. Not dramatically, just drifted upward like it had forgotten gravity existed. No one panicked. One crew member reached out, caught it, set it back down. They exchanged a look. Not fear, just awareness. Outside, the stars began to shift. Not moving exactly, but blinking in strange patterns like someone was turning them on and off in a sequence. The ship's AI spoke up, calm and clear. Navigation anomaly detected, recalculating. But the screen showed it recalculating the same route over and over, as if stuck in a loop. Then came the whispers. Not through the speakers, through the crew's neural implants. You could see it in their faces. A sudden pause, a flicker of confusion, a hand going to the temple. One engineer muttered, "Did you just hear your own name?" Another whispered back, "Yeah, but it wasn't me who said it." The room in the Concorde briefing chamber grew quieter. The Zarathi stopped chewing. The Mirkesh leaned forward, antennae twitching. On screen, the crew stayed focused. They ran diagnostics, checked hull integrity, verified oxygen levels. Everything read normal. But the feeling was wrong. You could see it in their eyes, the way they glanced at each other a little longer, the way their movements became more deliberate, like they were afraid of making sudden noise. Then the spire appeared, not with a bang, not with flashing lights. It just filled the viewport, black, jagged, impossibly large. No reflection, no surface details. Just pure, silent darkness shaped like a broken monument. The moment it came into view, the ship's lights dimmed. Not all at once, just enough to cast long shadows. The crew didn't scream, didn't run. They stood very still, watching. One of them said softly, "It's not a ruin. It's awake." From that point on, time itself seemed to unravel. Clocks on the walls ticked backward for 3 seconds. A crew member walked into a room, then walked out again, only to be seen on another camera entering the same room from the opposite side. It wasn't a glitch. It was like reality had folded in on itself. Yet through it all, the crew kept working. Calmly, methodically. They weren't heroes in armor. They were scientists, pilots, engineers, ordinary people facing something that defied every law they knew. And instead of breaking, they adapted. They realized the spire responded to attention. The more they observed it, the stronger its influence grew. So they started doing the opposite, sitting in silence, turning off non-essential systems, avoiding direct eye contact with the viewport. One of them said, "Maybe it's not evil. Maybe it's just hungry. And we're the first thing it's seen in a million years." Then came the plan. They gathered in the command center. No shouting, no panic. Just quiet voices laying out a desperate idea. If they couldn't escape, they could at least send a warning that would survive. Not in standard code that would be twisted or erased, but in something the spire couldn't understand. Ancient human languages, forgotten scripts, patterns of silence. They worked fast, fingers flying over consoles, voices low but steady. You could see the exhaustion in their faces, the strain in their eyes, but not despair. Never despair as the ship began to dissolve. Around them, not explode, not shatter, but fade like ink in water. They activated the quantum relay. The last shot showed the main viewport. The spire filled the screen, and in the reflection of the glass you could see the crew standing together, hands on each other's shoulders, not looking at the horror outside, but at each other. Then static. The screen went black. In the briefing room, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was so thick you could hear someone's breath catch. The Zorathi delegate slowly lowered the snack he'd been holding. His scales had gone pale. The Mirkesh sat perfectly still, mandibles slightly parted. Even the usually unshakable Velnari elder had tears in their eyes, something their species hadn't shown in public for centuries. The human ambassador didn't say a word. She didn't need to, because in that moment everyone in the room understood. This wasn't recklessness. This wasn't arrogance. This was sacrifice, pure, quiet, and total. The humans hadn't gone in to prove they were brave. They'd gone in because someone had to. And when they realized they couldn't come back, they made sure their last act wasn't about themselves, but about protecting everyone else. One delegate finally whispered, "They knew." "And they went anyway?" The ambassador just nodded, and for the first time since humans joined the Conquered, the galaxy didn't see them as loud, impulsive children. They saw them as the ones who walked into the dark so the rest of them wouldn't have to. The room stayed silent long after the footage ended. No one wanted to be the first to speak, because words felt too small for what they'd just witnessed, but deep down every one of them knew. Everything had changed. The morning after the screening, no one in the Conquered assembly knew quite how to act. The usual bustle of the central hub, the clatter of alien footsteps, the hum of translator drones, the easy banter between delegates, was gone. In its place was a quiet so heavy it felt like walking through fog. Delegates moved slowly, eyes downcast, voices hushed. Even the Zorathi, usually loud and full of swagger, kept to themselves, their scales dull with something that looked a lot like shame. No one had slept. How could they? The footage played over and over in their minds. The calm faces, the steady hands, the way the crew had faced the impossible, not with weapons, but with quiet courage. It wasn't the kind of bravery that shouted. It was the kind that whispered, "Someone has to do this," and then did it anyway. By midday, an emergency session was called. Not by the Velnari or the Cathar, the usual voices of caution, but by the Mirkesh, who rarely took strong stances on anything. Their representative stood at the podium, antennae lowered in solemn respect, and said only, "We must act." Not out of fear, out of honor. The motion was simple. Reinstate the ban on the Andromeda exclusion zone, not just for humans, but for everyone. No ships, no probes, no scans, not even passive observation from a distance. The zone would be sealed off completely, marked with warning buoys in every known language, including the ancient Earth scripts from the Odyssey's final message. This time, there was no debate. No jokes, no eye-rolling. One by one, species that had once mocked the idea now stood to support it. The bird-like delegates, who'd once called humans reckless, now said they saw the truth before we did. The reptilian Zorathi, who'd mimed monkey gestures just months before, now bowed their heads and said, "We owe them more than silence. We owe them remembrance." The vote passed unanimously, not because they were afraid, though they were, but because they finally understood what humans had been trying to say all along. Some things aren't meant to be explored. Some doors are closed for a reason, but the real shift wasn't in the law. It was in the way the galaxy saw humanity. Before, humans were the new kids, loud, fast, always pushing boundaries, always asking, "Why not?" Now they were seen as something else entirely. Not reckless, not arrogant, but responsible. The kind of species that would walk into a nightmare just to make sure no one else had to. The human ambassador was invited to speak at the closing of the session. She didn't wear ceremonial robes or bring a speech. She just walked to the center of the chamber, looked out at the hundreds of faces, scales, feathers, kite, and fur, and said 3 sentences. "We don't ask for thanks. We don't need monuments, just don't forget why the ban exists." Then she turned and walked out. No applause followed. None was needed. The silence itself was the tribute. Back on Earth, the news spread quietly. There were no victory parades, no headlines screaming, "Galaxy finally listens." Instead, families of the Odyssey's crew received simple messages from the conquered, written in human languages, signed by dozens of species, thanking them for their loved ones' courage. In schools, the mission was added to history lessons, not as a tragedy but as a lesson in duty. Children learned not just what happened, but why it mattered. That true strength isn't about how far you can go, but how much you're willing to give up for others. Meanwhile, deep in conquered archives, the footage was sealed under the highest classification, not to hide it, but to protect it. It was labeled The Lesson, and access was restricted to only those who needed to understand the cost of curiosity without wisdom. New recruits in every conquered fleet were shown it during their final training, not to scare them, but to remind them. Exploration is noble, but respect is essential. The Andromeda exclusion zone itself became something sacred. Ships gave it a wide berth. Even pirates and smugglers who ignored every other rule steered clear. Rumor had it that if you got too close, your instruments would glitch, your dreams would turn strange, and you'd hear whispers in languages you'd never learned. But no one tested it. Not anymore. And Earth didn't gloat. They didn't say, "We told you so." Instead, they doubled down on quiet vigilance. They kept monitoring the edge of the zone, not with ships, but with passive sensors placed light years away, designed to detect even the faintest ripple. If the spire ever stirred again, they'd be the first to know, and they'd be ready to warn the galaxy once more. What surprised everyone was how the other species responded. The Velnari sent Earth ancient texts on cosmic containment, knowledge they'd guarded for millennia. The Cathar shared data from their own lost missions, hoping it might help humans understand the spire better. Even the Zorathi, once the loudest critics, began quietly funding human-led research into non-invasive deep space observation. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was trust, and that was rarer than any treaty. In the months that followed, something subtle changed in how humans were treated across the galaxy. At trade talks, their opinions were listened to. At scientific conferences, their theories were taken seriously. When Earth proposed new safety protocols for exploring unstable regions, no one laughed. They asked questions. They took notes, because now the galaxy knew. When humans say stop, they're not being dramatic. They've already seen what's ahead, and perhaps the most human thing of all was this: they never asked for credit. They didn't rename the zone after the Odyssey. They didn't demand memorials. They just kept doing what they'd always done, watching the dark, so the rest of the galaxy could sleep in the light. Years later, a young delegate from a newly joined species asked an old Velnari elder why the Andromeda Zone was off limits. The elder didn't talk about energy signatures or ancient ruins. They simply said, "Go watch the lesson, and remember, the bravest thing a species can do is walk away." That's how the story lived on, not in laws or logs, but in the quiet choices made every day by those who understood what the Odyssey's crew had truly given them. Not just a warning, but a chance to be better. And in a galaxy full of wonders and terrors, that was the rarest gift of all. Years passed. The Andromeda exclusion zone stayed quiet, so quiet it became a kind of legend. New generations of pilots grew up hearing about it not as a place, but as a lesson. Don't go near the silent spire, parents would tell their children. Not because it's scary, but because someone already paid the price so you wouldn't have to. The footage from the Odyssey, now known simply as the lesson, was shown only to those who needed to understand the weight of exploration. Not as a horror story, but as a reminder. Curiosity without care is just recklessness in disguise. And in every conquered academy, on every training ship, in every species history class, the story was told the same way. Not with fanfare, but with respect. But what really changed wasn't just the rules. It was how the galaxy saw humanity. Before, humans were the loud newcomers, always pushing, always asking, "What if?" Now they were the ones others turned to when something didn't make sense. When a strange signal came from deep space, or a derelict station started broadcasting an unknown code, the first message sent wasn't "send a warship," it was "ask Earth." Not because humans had better tech, they often didn't, but because they'd proven something deeper. They understood that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, some are meant to be honored, And humans never acted like they'd earned special status. They didn't boast. They didn't demand favors. When the Mirkesh lost a research vessel near a quantum rift, it was a human salvage team that volunteered to help, not to recover the ship, but to recover the crew's final logs, so their families could have closure. When the Zarathi's homeworld faced a solar flare crisis, Earth quietly rerouted 3 of its deep space energy harvesters to help stabilize their grids. No press, no speeches, just action. That's what surprised everyone most. Humans didn't want to be heroes. They just wanted to do what was right and then get back to work. Back on Earth, life went on. Cities grew. Children played under skies full of stars they'd never visit. But in quiet corners, labs buried under mountains, observatories floating in orbit, classrooms in small towns, people still talked about the Odyssey. Not with sadness, but with quiet pride. Teachers would say, they didn't die for nothing. They died so we'd all be a little wiser. And the families of the crew? They didn't ask for statues or holidays. One mother planted a tree for her child, a simple oak that grew slowly, steadily, reaching for the light. A sibling started a scholarship for students studying cosmic ethics. Another kept a small journal, writing letters to their lost brother or sister every year on the day the signal went silent. Not to mourn, but to remember. You taught us how to look without touching, how to wonder without wandering too far. Meanwhile, the Concorde kept its promise. The zone remained untouched. Warning buoys floated at its edge, broadcasting the Odyssey's final message in over 200 languages, including the old Earth tongues no one spoke anymore. Ships that drifted too close would receive an automatic alert. Turn back, for your safety, for their memory. And every single one did. Even pirates who ignored every other law in the galaxy gave the zone a wide berth. Some said it was superstition. Others claimed their instruments went haywire near the boundary. But the real reason was simpler. They'd all seen the lesson. And no amount of stolen cargo was worth forgetting what those 12 people gave up. What made the story stick wasn't the horror, it was the calm. The way the crew didn't panic. The way they worked together until the very end. The way they chose to send a warning instead of a plea. That's what haunted people, not the spire, but the humanity. And slowly, quietly, the galaxy began to change. Exploration missions started including ethics officers, not just scientists, but thinkers trained to ask, should we? Before, can we? New protocols required 3 independent risk assessments before entering unknown regions. And every ship, no matter its origin, now carried a copy of the lesson in its emergency archive. Humans didn't create these rules, but their example made others want to follow them. At the annual Concorde Assembly, the human ambassador still sat in the back. Still spoke rarely. But now when she did, the room fell silent, not out of politeness but out of respect. And when she walked through the halls, delegates from 100 species would nod, not with pity but with gratitude. One day, a young delegate from a newly spacefaring species asked her, "Why didn't you just stay away? Why send your people in at all?" She thought for a long time before answering. Then she said, "Because if no one looks, no one knows. And if no one knows, everyone is in danger. We didn't go in to be brave. We went in because someone had to. And if it had to be us, we wanted to make sure it was worth it." The young delegate didn't say anything after that. But years later, when their own people faced a similar choice, they remembered those words and chose caution. That's how the legacy lived on. Not in monuments or medals, but in choices. In the quiet moments when someone decided to turn back instead of charging ahead. When a scientist chose to study from a distance instead of landing on a strange world. When a captain rerouted their ship just to be safe. The Odyssey was gone. But its message wasn't. And in a galaxy full of wonders, dangers and endless unknowns, that message became more valuable than any discovery. Some things are better left alone. Not because we're afraid, but because we care enough to protect each other from what we don't understand. That's the real human way, not to conquer the dark, but to guard the light. And that's why even now, when ships pass near the edge of the Andromeda exclusion zone, their crews sometimes pause, not out of fear, but out of thanks. They look at the stars, say nothing, and keep flying just a little more carefully than before.